Hello and welcome everybody to this month's Lunch and Learn session for Connection Heroes. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Di Gates. I'm the founder of Connection Heroes. And we're on a mission to unleash the power of human connection in workplaces across the world. And that's kind of what we look like in action. And the reason why I founded Connection Heroes a couple of years ago now is because there is absolutely a connection crisis happening in the workplace. It was accelerated definitely by the pandemic, but that's not the reason it exists. The forces that have been driving disconnection in the workplace have been at play for absolutely years. But the reality is it is now at the point where it's having a critical impact both on people and productivity and profitability. And when we go into organizations and we deliver training and we teach about the neuroscience of human connection, and we talk about ways of working that can really help link teams so that we can support each other through the trials and tribulations of the current marketplace that is increasingly fast moving and chaotic and unpredictable, what's really important to us when we deliver this training is that improving connection means ensuring that absolutely everybody in the organizations that we work with feels seen, heard, valued, and trusted. And we'll often say that an organization is only as connected as its least connected person. So quite often we use these monthly webinars to shine a light on maybe some underrepresented groups, some proportions of the workplace who maybe don't feel as seen and heard, who maybe don't feel as valued and trusted. And that particular group that we're looking at on this occasion is our introverted clients, our introverted colleagues. And our expert for the day and our very welcome guest is Sam. So hello, Sam, welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me, Di.
Absolutely our pleasure. So I first heard Sam speak at an HR conference, I'm going to say about 6 months ago. And Sam was the one talk at that event that really stayed with me. And she explained, and I was fascinated by, the concept of extroversion bias. And this was a new concept to me. And Sam explained what extroversion bias was, and she'll give you guys that insight later on, and the impact that can have on both individuals and team performance and organizational performance. And Sam's a real expert in this topic of introversion at work. She's an experienced coach, so does a lot of coaching work with introverts so they can reach their potential and perform to their optimum in the workplace and outside of work. And she's a really in-demand speaker. So Sam talks at corporate events, HR summit, leadership conferences, women in business events, well-being events, all sorts of places. And I'm really delighted that you've been able to join us today, Sam. I know I'm going to learn a lot from you, and I'm sure everybody else is going to really benefit from your insights. So I'm going to stop sharing there so we don't have to keep looking at those slides. Sam, first and foremost, the topic of introverts in the workplace, why is this something that matters to you? Why is this an area that you've chosen to do your work?
Oh, okay. So a few years ago, I was working on a project with Google facilitating training, and I worked with over 5,000 people across 169 different countries on that project.
Bloody hell.
But yeah, I know. It's like in retrospect, I'm like, how did I do that? But I did. Uh, but when I was doing that, a clear pattern emerged. So the training itself was nothing to do with introversion, but in every session in the Q&A, I would get the same questions. What was very clear was that globally, it was introverts who were struggling most with limiting beliefs and imposter syndrome, which were aspects of the training, and also this concept of feeling enough. And as an introvert myself, it really struck me because they were the same struggles that I'd had, but I'd spent my whole life thinking it was just me, that I
Okay.
wasn't enough and that I didn't feel like I fit in anywhere, or that maybe I was slightly weird because of me as an individual. It didn't occur to me that this could be a wider thing because of an aspect of who I am.
When you got that feedback, Sam,
Yeah.
did people feel the same? Did people think it was just them?
Yes.
Was this individual? Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah. And that was so interesting. And I'm a bit of a nerd, so that sent me down a research rabbit hole into introversion because whilst I'd identified as an introvert for a very long time, I didn't really have an in-depth understanding of what it meant beyond what most people would understand that introversion means. And so I started researching, and when I was reading in more depth around the neuroscience behind introversion and extroversion, and just the research in general that surrounds those things, it really hit my injustice button because that's the point that I discovered the extroversion bias, especially in the workplace. It's a societal bias, but it's showing up with
Did
most
you,
consequence in the workplace.
and were people and researchers writing and talking about extroversion bias, or were they talking about, a number of individual biases which you could then see were systemic?
A little of both, but more of the latter. So
Right.
that there are some studies that will talk about an extroversion bias, but mostly it's looking at that bigger picture and seeing that it is very much a systemic bias that is prevalent across all of our workplaces. And so that gave me a mission and a purpose to try and, in some way at least, dismantle the bias and, just create working environments that enable all employees to thrive and not just one half of the workforce.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you to give us all an explanation of this extroversion bias a little bit later in the conversation. But as you've said, it's kind of become your mission to try and, redress the balance in the workplace. And so I'm sure you spend a lot of your time trying to convince leaders that this is not just a good thing to do for people, but a good thing to do for productivity and profitability and all of those KPIs that, get chatted about in the boardroom. So if we've got people on the call today who want to make the case for supporting introversion, how would you frame that? Why should leaders in the world of work today really be caring about whether their introverts on their team are connected and engaged? What's the commercial thinking behind this?
Well, firstly, it's already affecting business performance. As I touched upon, introverts make up statistically around half the workforce, and in some industries it will be more than that. It really, varies, but in general, on average, it's half the workforce. So
Mhm.
that's a significant proportion of an organization's talent that are currently being overlooked and underutilized. And when it comes to things like inclusion and EDI, which often has a lot of investment put into it, because introversion isn't classed as a protected
Mhm.
characteristic, it's very commonly overlooked. Yet introversion intersects with every other grouping that there is. And
Oh,
so,
in terms of kind of like looking at there's an intersection between things like neurodiversity, things like other areas of protected characteristics. Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
so if I
Okay.
use myself as an example, I'm female, I have an anxiety disorder. I'm very likely neurodivergent. I'm undergoing testing this year,
Yeah.
but very, very likely
Yeah.
neurodivergent. And I'm an introvert. So
Yeah.
that's not just one area that is touching upon how I'm showing up in a workplace, how I'm being treated in a workplace, what's going to enable me to thrive or hold me back in a workplace. That's four different areas. And if we
Yeah.
only look at them in isolation, then we're missing the bigger picture and we're not actually able to put systems and ways of working in place that are going to help someone like me.
Absolutely. It's interesting. That topic of intersectionality comes up time and time again in these webinars. So we did our last webinar last month. We had Drew Dalton talking about how we can connect and engage our LGBTQIA plus colleagues. Before that, we've looked at menopause, we've looked at neurodiversity, we've looked at kind of mental health challenges. It's almost like, God, leaders are so many leaders find it hard to even just have an honest conversation about one of these characteristics. When you start talking about intersectionality, do you find it makes people run for the hills, or are you finding that that people are starting to open up and realize this is a useful conversation?
I think there's a small number of people currently starting to open up, those that are more perhaps open or forward thinking or thinking in terms of the future workforce.
Yeah.
But there's definitely quite a large proportion of leaders that I'm finding at the moment that aren't really open and aren't really thinking about how this is an investment for the business because it impacts so many employees on scale. And it's
Yeah,
well known, there are studies that show that if an employee is operating in an environment that isn't conducive to that employee being productive and having a certain level of well-being, they're not going to operate to their full potential. They're not going to have the output that you would want. It's going to reduce things like innovation. And so if we're talking about culture and we're talking about inclusion, we really do need to be thinking about everybody within an organization and what can be put in place so that all talent can thrive.
absolutely. I think the latest Gallup stats in terms of the drop in productivity due to a disengaged workforce, and many of those employees are disengaged because their preferences and their working styles aren't recognised or supported. The current annual cost of that productivity drop is $438 billion. So it's not
Yeah.
pennies, is it?
No, it's not.
I
No,
mean,
significant.
you would have thought when again, we'll come on to a more detailed definition of what an introvert is, but my understanding of an introvert, I think there must be opportunities, surely, in today's workplace that would play to the strength. So I'm thinking, for example, asynchronous communication. Yeah, it was a thing we didn't have in workplaces maybe 5, 6 years, 7, 8 years ago, not to the same degree. So by asynchronous communication, I mean having centralized, for example, having centralized documents or data stores where we might interact, Sam, on working on that together, not at the same time. So I'd put a document together, you would comment on it, I would review your comments. So we're working asynchronously. We're not talking in real time with pressure for you to, think on the spot, come up with ideas on the spot. So I would have thought things like asynchronous communications are an opportunity to play to the strengths of the introverts. Is that not really happening?
It's not happening yet. But what you've touched upon there, Di, is exactly why this is important in a business sense, because more than ever before, this is an opportunity that can be leveraged, that could increase productivity, performance, profit margins, innovation, the works. Because as you say, we're now operating in a world where we have asynchronous ways of working, where people can be hybrid or remote. And those are ways of working that typically are better and more conducive to introverts thriving in their role than, for example, an open office structure, which can become overwhelming and overstimulating. And so this is the time to leverage that opportunity and review what systems are in place to enable the future of that company to, to place that organization at a competitive advantage in the future workforce.
I do. I think it's fascinating. I think the world of work is changing so much that we've got to change anyway. So it's
Yeah,
whether we design for everyone or whether we keep designing for those who have taken advantage of system to date. Like it does feel like there's a moment here where we've got to redesign anyway.
exactly that.
Well,
Exactly that.
I think this would be really good if we want to really understand who we're designing for. Can you kind of speak to us, Sam, either from a personal experience or a neuroscientific perspective? Who are we talking about? What are we talking about when we're talking about introverts and introversion?
Before I answer that, Di, I'd really like to ask anybody that's on the call today to just type in the
Oh,
chat
wake
box.
up, everyone! Wake up!
Going to ask you to do something, to just type in the chat box what word or phrase comes to mind immediately when we say the word introvert.
Okay, let's see what
The
we can do.
first thing, don't overthink it. So you've got
Energy.
energy. This one's interesting because I know Vanessa.
Ah,
This one's interesting, but we've got quiet as quite a popular response. Less than. Oh, Greer.
oh,
I want to hug Greer.
again,
She's not
probably
less than.
three. No, but quiet, less than. Is this a question that you ask in your talks and training sessions, Sam?
Sometimes, yeah. Obviously, the content varies, but yes. But it's something that I do also put on social media. I talk about with my community. I talk about with clients in general. So it's something that is a question I hear responses to a lot, and quiet would be one of the most popular responses. And if you think about it, one of the most popular books on introversion by Susan Cain is called Quiet. And I mean, it's a great book. It's a great book, and it's done a lot to champion introverts, including in the workplace. But it is playing into our associations with introversion and quiet being synonymous with each other.
Mm.
Um,
So
if
what
I
else do
were
you
to
hear?
if I were to repeat that question and ask those on the chat to type the phrase or word that comes to mind if I say extrovert, I think that would be really interesting before we go a little bit deeper into the question.
Mm.
Look at that. Active, talkative, confident, celebrated.
Mm. Yeah.
So, what I'm noticing just from those initial responses is that the words for introversion, not that quiet itself is inherently negative, but were more negative than the words that we've got for extroversion there. We've got confident, talkative obviously could be either, but it's Vanessa
Mhm.
giving that. But we've got celebrated. And this is what I typically see when I ask this question, regardless of who the audience is that's answering. The words
Mhm.
and phrases that we associate with introversion inherently tend to be negative, and those we associate with extroversion tend to be positive. Now, the vast majority of the words that we've had in the chat and that I receive from whenever I ask the question actually have nothing to do with either introversion or extroversion at all. So if we take confident, it is very common for people to associate extroverts with being confident, and also things like outgoing, friendly, social, um,
Mm.
just those are the associations we have with extroversion. For introversion, quiet, yes, but also lacking confidence,
Mm.
antisocial, shy.
Mm.
But neither introversion nor extroversion is behavioral. What we're talking about is something that's neurological. So you mentioned kind of a neuroscience background to it. When I was looking at that research post Google revelation, what I found was that introverts have a larger prefrontal cortex and longer neural pathways. And what that means is we need time to think and process before we respond, because literally those thoughts have a longer journey to reach their destination.
Okay.
Extroverts have a smaller prefrontal cortex and shorter pathways, and that means they're more likely to be processing as they're speaking or by speaking, thinking in the moment. Of course, in a workplace, that gives them the advantage in, for example, a meeting where a
Mhm.
response in the moment is generally what's required. And the way the meeting is set up is to receive a response in the moment. So they have an advantage already just due to their brain biology.
And that's maybe why, because I've always been fascinated in the last 4 or 5 years, why asynchronous communication that allows for those longer thoughts and that preparation, it's not as dominant as I would have predicted it to
Yeah,
become given hybrid working. And I'm wondering whether that's because the people that set the rules, the people that were in charge of potentially switching strategically and tactically to asynchronous comms, are the extroverts. The
exactly.
format of quick fire thinking, real time comms, meetings back to back to back to back to back, that suits people with those faster synapses where the message doesn't have far to travel. So
And sorry,
is
go
there
ahead.
a if we've got, I suppose we're starting to tip into extroversion bias, and we'll come on to that. But I read a stat somewhere that although half the workplace are introverts, 96% of leaders are extroverts. So
Yes.
that's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so as you just said, and what I was about to say when you started to ask your
Mm.
question, is that is an example of the extrovert bias in action. That's a concrete example, as is the statistic that you shared. So 4% of leaders are introverts. And the reason for that isn't that introverts are not designed for leadership or are not as good as being a leader as an extrovert. It's because of the affinity bias, which is part of the wider systemic bias that filters out introverts when it comes to things like promotions and leadership. So there was study in 2020 by McCord and Joseph, and that found that introverts are less likely to receive promotions, high visibility assignments, or salary increases. And that feeds into that. It's all part of the bias. People are hiring the people who are like them for the promotions and the leadership positions. And our perception of what success looks like and what good looks like in the workplace is very much driven by that extrovert bias.
Yeah. And this is quite culturally entrenched, isn't it? This has been built over years and years.
Very much so. Can we
I mean,
just go back to the definition of introversion?
yeah,
There's one other component that's important to speak about, and that's arousal level and dopamine. So,
yeah,
and like just brain chemistry in general. So, introverts will start the day with a higher level of arousal than an extrovert. So, as an introvert moves through the day, and they are having interactions with people, they're navigating a busy commute, they're trying to do their work in an open office, perhaps feeling that they should be present for after work drinks and then engage in family commitments after. All of those things are increasing the level of stimulation and arousal. And it means that an introvert at some point is going to need to take time alone to recharge and reset because they are overstimulated and overwhelmed. And
yeah,
it's a neurobiological necessity. That's why introverts need alone time. So introverts can be extremely social and they can enjoy being social, but they will at some point need that alone time because they have that higher arousal level and they get more easily overstimulated. Whereas extroverts are driven more by dopamine. They're seeking out, they need more dopamine. And so they are looking for novelty and stimulation and interactions because if they're alone without stimulation, that's what's going to drain them. And so to summarize that question of what is introversion, it's an individual that requires time to process thought, but also needs to manage their energy through alone time and regulation.
absolutely. And what I guess where extroversion bias comes in is the systems are designed to support those energy management needs of the extroverts more than the energy management needs of the introvert.
Yes.
It's interesting. We're totally going off piste here, but I'm quite cool with that if you are, Sam. You said earlier, which is obviously the case, that this isn't a protected characteristic.
Yes.
Yet we're also in the same breath saying, but this is not a behavioural issue. This is a neurodevelopmental issue, or not a neurological issue. So,
Mm.
should it be a protected characteristic, or is that a can of worms that you don't want to open?
I mean, I think it should be.
Mm,
But that's only because of the way systems are in workplaces currently. Like it shouldn't have to be, if that makes sense. It's
yes.
half the
Yeah. No.
workforce.
Yeah. I hear
But
exactly what you mean.
I feel like the only way we could truly enact the sort of change that I personally very strongly believe should be enacted is if it were a protected characteristic, because I feel like that's the only way this is going to be taken seriously
Take
by
it
the
seriously.
majority, as opposed to right now, there's a minority taking it seriously.
I mean, we've just had a great comment in the chat there. I don't know if you can see it from Greer. I'm a leader and find it tricky promoting introversion and supporting it when the rest of the leadership team are mostly extroverts. It often falls to me to say something, for example, designing a team day. I mean, thanks for sharing that and for being so open and honest in that. I mean, is that something you see when
Common.
there are introverted leaders, they're fighting an uphill battle?
It's common. I was once coaching an executive who the organization had approached me to coach this executive, saying that she was an introverted leader and she lacked presence. And when I actually began the coaching, it was very quickly apparent that she didn't lack presence. She was very well respected by her team and stakeholders. She'd fairly recently been promoted because of how excellent she was at the work that she did. She could hold a room, her presentations got really good feedback, but her manager was an extroverted male. And his perception was that she lacked presence just because he knew she was introverted And so she'd been put forward for coaching by the organization for that reason, when actually it was her manager that perhaps required some sort of intervention and not
Right.
her. And just to speak to that point in the chat, because that's what she'd been told, you lack presence, you need coaching to address this because you're an executive now and this is what's required. She too was not able to speak up in rooms in the sense that we're talking about, because the people in those rooms weren't going to listen to anything that she might have to say because they're so entrenched in that bias.
That's a really difficult situation, isn't it? And I'm sure it's one that must be repeated in all shapes and sizes of organisation. It's really challenging. I mean, so we've touched on a couple of examples there of extroversion bias in terms of those who are leaders not being able to stand up, in terms of meetings and systems and communication styles perhaps being designed to favour the thinking styles of the extrovert, and another really interesting point, and to really support the energy management preferences
Yeah.
of the extroverts. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this extroversion bias is, and maybe some other examples of how it shows up, so that people can maybe see if they can recognise this in their own organisations?
Yeah, sure. I mean, really, it's pretty much every aspect of the workplace. I will break down specific
All right,
examples.
nothing much then.
Nothing
Nothing
much,
easy
no.
going on, right?
But it's
Okay.
because the bias means that our workplaces are designed to suit extroverted preferences and needs and ways of working. And so that in fact affects everything from the physical environment to, as you say, meetings and communication, to ways of working, to promotions, hiring, all of those things. If we take the physical environment first of all, the big thing for me right now that I'm most concerned about is the return to office mandates that are happening in so many organizations. Because as we've already touched upon, for introverts and other employees too, so we've mentioned neurodivergent employees, for example, if you have hybrid or remote ways of working available, often they are the environments that will enable those types of employees to thrive. But so many organizations right now are mandating you have to return to the office, and it's becoming an increasing number of days, and for some full time back in the office. And they're saying that's about culture and about like team morale, but it's
Mm.
only improving culture and team morale for extroverts. It's not doing that for introverted employees. I touched upon this when I was talking about the neuroscience, but the open office environments that are common for most of us if we're working in an office type based role, they are very overstimulating and a barrier for focus when it comes to introverts, because you've got that constant background level of noise, you've got
Mhm.
interruptions. And I know for myself, if I'm in flow working on a task and someone says, "Oh, can I just ask you something quickly?" That is it. Like I cannot get back into
Mhm.
that state for a significant period of time. So it's a barrier to my productivity not to be able to manage interruptions in the way that you can if you're remote or hybrid and you've got more control over
Yeah.
that. There's the culture that to be successful, you need to be busy and in back-to-back meetings. And we've already touched upon meetings themselves are heavily biased in favor of extroverted ways of working and ways of thinking. And then, and this is my passion area, training and development.
Mm.
Because actually recently I was approached to do some training, and it was for an organization that was made up of software engineers mainly, that the department that was engaging in the training. And so the likelihood is that the majority of those attendees would be introverts. And I didn't do the learning design. They just asked if I would be open to facilitating the training, but it was role play based
Oh
training.
God. Right.
And the unfortunate thing is that whilst there can be a place for role plays in training, the majority of the time they don't work for anything other than a particular demographic of employee, because you can't access the learning and secure those desired learning outcomes if the person isn't feeling psychologically safe and has that like anxiety barrier. And yet I am increasingly, and this has been over the last maybe 5 years, seeing across organizations that it's like the in thing to have actors and role plays in training.
Yeah.
And that's seen as like, oh, we want experiential learning. We want it to be interactive and engaging. And yes, learning should be interactive and engaging, but it should also be differentiated in a
Mhm.
way that ensures that everybody present can actually access the learning. And I actually threw out on my threads, which is my highest social media audience of introverts,
Mhm.
how do you feel about role plays in training?
Oh
And
God.
I got an overwhelming response, but some of the comments were equally hilarious and heartbreaking, as in the things people were saying they would rather do than engage in role plays in training. Like, honestly, you would, at some point, I'm going to make a LinkedIn post about it and share it because, like sawing their leg off would be a very tame example of what these people would be prepared to do rather than role plays in training. And yet, as I say, this is currently, it's not, it's been around for the whole time that I've been facilitating training, but it's currently very like on trend to have
Yeah.
actors and role plays. Same with starting a session by sharing fun facts and going around in a circle, like that kind of thing. Like there's very little awareness that I see in training sessions and learning design that there is more than one type of learner present and that we should be making sure that everyone can access the learning.
It's really interesting. The Connection Heroes is my first foray into the world of L&D delivery, and demand from our clients is at least for 80% in person, which is great because we're teaching the skills to improve human connection. So I've not got a problem with that. But it is really, really interesting in terms of that switch from Monday. It's not what I was expecting. I was expecting more real time in the flow of work, kind of self-guided learning would be what people were wanting, and it's not. And one of the things that we talk a lot about, though, is can we shift the conversation a little bit? Because I'm not anti face-to-face at all, and I'm not anti working in synchronously in the same space with people. I think there's certain types of work or certain times and projects where it's the optimal way to work. But can we shift the conversation from just like physical connection? So how many days should we be next to each other? How many days in the office? How many other? It's polarizing and it's reductive because you either agree we should be in the office more or not. There's nowhere to go from that. Whereas if we can switch the conversation to how can we increase human connection, so how can we ensure people see and hear each other, trust and value each other, we can do that both while we're sitting next to each other and through a screen. It just takes a bit more effort, but we can play with that. We can create, and the same for learning and meetings. How do we create learning opportunities and meeting opportunities and project touch-ins that focus on human connection rather than physical connection? And the starting point's got to be for that. We're realizing that there's different types of humans involved here in this project. Yeah, what's what's going to work?
Exactly. And I agree with you. It's not that there shouldn't be anything in person. It's that there's a big difference between some, for example, training sessions or meetings or aspects of work requiring an in-person interaction and mandating that everybody has to be back in the office for 3, 4, 5 days a week.
Yeah,
And oftentimes also when those mandates are in place, those employees are the only person in that particular office and they're still just on Teams or Zoom or Google Meet calls all day because their colleagues are actually elsewhere.
yeah, it is. But there's a lot of craziness to go on. But I think also we're still a lot of these changes and a lot of this sudden increase. So half the world who can now work hybrid. There's 500,000 managers trying to figure out this new world of work and how to do it. So it's tough, right? And we're entering, or we've entered, a big period of trial and error, I think. So that's fair enough. But if people on the call or watching this are kind of maybe recognizing some of these, they're looking at the way they deliver learning or run meetings or run project comms and thinking, okay, right, yeah, we might be guilty of this. I'm interested to know what they could do about it, because a lot of the ways in which we run training, we run meetings, they're quite entrenched. And you said something to me when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, and it really struck me. You said that with some of your clients, you do asynchronous coaching. Now
Yes.
that blew my mind, because in my mind, coaching is a real-time conversation between an individual and a trusted coach. And to me, the idea that coaching could be done asynchronously blew my mind. So maybe you could explain how that works, and if we can if we can change something as fundamentally structured as coaching to suit introverts, maybe that can help us understand how we can tackle some other areas. So yeah, how does asynchronous coaching work?
Before I answer that, I'm just going to give the context to how it came to be, because then I
Yeah,
think it will
okay.
make more sense. So when I was training as a coach, it was before COVID, way before COVID. And at the time we were told that coaching sessions are in person. That's the kind of traditional way of coaching. It has to be an in-person interaction.
Yeah.
And then COVID hit and it became much more common to have coaching online or via a phone call, perhaps, like depending. That did happen before COVID, but it was very, very rare.
Mhm.
And for me, if I am being coached or mentored or engaging in therapy, there's an energy cost when it comes to being on a call, whether it's an audio call or a video call, there's an energy cost to me. And I have struggled a little bit myself with being able to get all that I needed to get out of those type of interactions, because they occur on a particular date at a particular time, regardless of what's going on in my life or what I need. And
Mhm.
they require there's something that's going to drain me of energy. So if I've already got a lot going on, then that's an additional energy drain. So
Yeah.
a little while ago, it occurred to me that what I would want for myself would be asynchronous coaching, because I think much better and I communicate, I think, more strongly in writing. Like that's my comfort zone. That's what I like to do. In my social relationships with friends and family, I mainly text. It's very
Mhm.
rare that I will engage in calls. And so that's what's natural to me. And I thought, what if there was a way that I could offer what I would have wanted for myself? So then I started experimenting with people I knew, first of all, and it worked. It
Good.
really did work. That there is no reason why you can't choose a platform that works for that person. So it might be something that's a bit more formal, like emails. It might be something more like WhatsApp or Telegram, and you can use text messages or voice notes. And it gives the coachee the control. Because if they are going through something, maybe they've got a big important meeting or presentation coming up and they're really in their head about it, they can have more intervention at that point in time rather than waiting for a designated slot like a week later or
Mhm.
whenever it may be to have that. And also, because introverts need time to process their thoughts, that real time verbal conversation in the moment isn't necessarily always going to be the best format in order for them
Mhm.
to get what they need from it. Because it might be that after the call, they're thinking, I didn't say that thing that I wanted to say, or I've just thought of this additional thing, or in the moment they feel put on the spot.
Yeah.
Whereas with asynchronous coaching, it's very much about they are driving the conversation. They might just need a weekly check-in sometimes. They might need like really intense back and forth other times, but
Mhm.
it's in a format that works for them. If there's any nuances that a text message or email wouldn't address, voice note is an option. And then that's, apart from the fact that it's not necessarily exactly real time, it means that it's not that much different to a call. And yeah, I've just found that it's really successful and it works with how introverts are wired rather than against it.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I guess you could take those principles and say, right, how would they work in the context of PDRs, appraisals, career development conversations? How
Yeah,
could they work? Because there is a flow, although currently, presently, the demand is for in-person real-time training. I think we will get to the point where the trajectory will hit back on kind of just-in-time learning, in the moment
yeah,
learning. So I guess
yeah,
there's principles there. But you said something to me which was interesting, was you identified what you needed, and then you just used the word experiment.
yeah,
So that's identify if we take the time to recognize that we've got some extroversion bias happening in our workplaces, we maybe speak with our introvert colleagues and find out what works for them and what have they got maybe some different needs, and then experiment, open-minded, testing some assumptions. And I think for a lot of for a lot of leaders that I work with through Connection Heroes, there's a fear of getting things wrong or there is a fear because there's so much change in the workplace. Almost every organisation I've worked with in the last 12 months has undergone some sort of massive leadership rechange, some kind of restructure of core services, often redundancies. There's so much change that I think a lot of leaders are a bit scared to initiate new stuff. But experimenting, innovating, that's controlled change, isn't it? And it's controlled change towards a human-focused goal. And that's a very different type of change than just knee-jerk reacting, isn't it?
It is, but it's also very much aligned with the future of work because innovation, design thinking processes, for example, they are what are currently giving businesses the competitive advantage and what will continue to do so in the future. And the only certainty we have in life or in work is that everything's going to change. So learning to have that iteration and growth mindset and to, as you say, identify something, experiment, iterate, and then pivot accordingly. That is the secret to success in any area.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think it's, exercising that neuroplasticity, understanding that we can change our habits, and not being fearful to do so. And I think if people are part of co-designing solutions as well, don't get that disconnection because people, even if the experiments don't work out, the respect that you get from employees from trying to progress, trying to make things better, it can make all the difference when it comes to kind of engagement, retention, and a lot of the challenges that employers are facing these days.
Yeah.
We've got 15 minutes left, and I'm really keen, Sam, for you to share kind of like with those on the call, maybe some practical kind of takeaways. Are there any things that people can start doing tomorrow? Any quick wins or anything that either leaders can do to increase the connection and engagement with their employees, or something that we can just do as colleagues for the people that we work with? What can we do to make life better for introverts in the workplace?
You've already touched upon one of the main things, which is actually talking to introverted colleagues or employees that you manage and having that conversation, asking what you need. Because the other thing that's important for us to be mindful of, we touched upon it with intersectionality, but it's that introversion and extroversion doesn't exist in isolation. And we are made up, our behavior, our personality is made up of a mosaic of lots of different things. So what will work for one introvert won't necessarily work for every introvert that's in that organization. So having that very human to human conversation and understanding people in your team is always going to be a win, regardless of whether you're a leader or a colleague. But then when it comes to the business itself, one of the main easy wins is around meetings, because meetings make up such a big part of most people's working week. They tend to breed other meetings, right? Most people are engaged in many different meetings across the week. And so to make some subtle changes with regards to meetings could really improve the connection within the team, but also the outcomes of what those meetings were trying to drive. So
what sort of changes? Yeah, what would you recommend?
We've mentioned this asynchronous way of working already, and it's rooted in that. But because introverts require time to process thought before speaking, it's sharing the agenda of what's going to be discussed in the meeting in advance of the meeting, ideally 24 or 48 hours in advance. That means that when the meeting begins, everybody present has had the opportunity to reflect upon what's going to be asked and formulate a response. And it means that those who process by speaking aren't then automatically advantaged by being asked a question in the moment and people invited to respond. It's about making sure whoever's chairing or facilitating the meeting is really aware of all the things that we've been talking about and making sure that there's not just the same few voices dominating the meeting, because that happens a lot, right? It's the same people talking in the meetings all the time. But rather than what often happens is picking on that quiet person sitting at the back and going, Di, what are you thinking about this? Which is putting them on the spot and isn't, going to be beneficial. It's thinking about how can I facilitate the meeting in a way that enables everybody to contribute. So that might be, for example, before having the discussion component, getting them to write down or, put on post-its whatever
Yeah.
it is that they're contributing, and then you're making like a visual wall
Yeah.
of what's emerging, and then discussing what's come out of that, rather than picking on individuals, or expecting certain people to contribute in a certain way. And then the final component is providing some sort of method. So you mentioned a collaborative document that you and I could both work upon, something like that for meeting attendees, to capture any post-meeting thoughts that arise within, again, maybe 24 hours after the meeting, because sometimes some of the best ideas aren't happening in the moment. And by enabling some time and space for those to be captured, it can secure better outcomes.
Yeah, I think there's a great advice, and I mean, you can't help but think, okay, so that's great, but I can imagine, there's going to be people who don't have time to do that, don't have time to, I don't know what the meeting topic's going to be 24 or 48 hours in advance. I don't have time to put extra documents together. You can feel it, and you can see people seeing it. And we hear that when we try to introduce connection rituals and different ways of working to facilitate some of this stuff, not all of this. This has been great for me. I've learned loads. And what we say is, if you genuinely want to prioritize connection, if you want to make sure that everybody in your organization is able to contribute to your success, which is what we're talking about, then as humans, we only really kind of prioritize what we value. If we don't value it, if we don't, it's important, we're never going to prioritize it. So we'll soon drop all of this prep, and we should drop it. If we don't want to do it, if we want to prioritize it, we have to value it. We have to value the contributions of introverts. But as humans, again, we only value what we understand. So I think building this understanding. So to me, this penny drop moment, that this isn't behavioral issues, this is neurological. You said, when you spoke to me about just like the length of distance that a thought has to travel, that's why it takes longer. That's what it's like, right, well, I get that. If I understand it and I value your contribution, Sam, then it makes sense to me as a business that I'm going to make these tactical changes or systems changes because I want your thoughts. I want them. I value them. And I think that's what it's about, because otherwise it just feels like an inconvenience. And there's a judgment there, isn't there? There's a judgment that, right, well, I'm better than you because I can think more quickly. Or whatever you can contribute, it's not going to be as valuable as what I'd come up with anyway. And it's this removing this judgment, I guess, isn't it?
That judgment is causing so much harm. So one of the most common things that I hear from people that reach out to me or that I work with is that they've been told that they're too quiet, but not just given it just as a casual comment. Like, it's often in the form of formal feedback in performance management sessions. And that's in a sense that it's not actually related to the work that they're doing. They can be smashing all their KPIs and, exceeding their deliverables. But then there's a but at the end. You're too quiet. You need to speak up more in meetings. And it's causing harm in a number of ways. So firstly, it makes that employee feel that there's something wrong with them. They're lacking, as we've already talked about. It means they're more likely to start masking and trying to show up in a way that's not authentic to them. And the consequence of that is mental health issues and burnout.
Absolutely.
So there's a cost there in terms of the employee. And then, of course, that then has a business cost, because if that employee leaves, then you've got the cost of hiring, losing, top talent potentially, because often the A players are introverts often as well. So they're losing top talent. And then aside from that, as you've said, they might feel in the moment, well, this is almost like additional work to make these changes. But what's the cost of that? Because currently you're only accessing the ideas and the potential of half the people in the room.
Yeah. It makes like so many things. The data and the stories and the case studies of the example are there to support something which should just be bloody common sense, isn't it? You're leaving half the talent of the organization on the table. Right, Sam, we're going to have to start wrapping it up. Thank you, Greer, Leonie, everyone on the comments and chats for joining in. Sam, honestly, huge heartfelt thanks for joining us. I could literally talk about this all day. I think it's absolutely fascinating. I hope that what we've touched on today has maybe shifted some minds and some understanding. I hope it's also given some some practical advice and ideas that people can take away. Just to very quickly wrap up the session today, we don't need to say hello. We've already said hello. We need to say thank you. I want to say massive thanks to you, Sam, and for everyone for joining us. If you want to find out a little bit more about what we do at Connection Heroes, that kind of massive QR code, which is far bigger than it needs to be, can take you to some more information about us. Please, if you're not already connected with Sam and I on LinkedIn, please do connect. As you can probably tell, we're both passionate about creating more inclusive workplaces with ways of working that are good for both people and productivity and profitability. You know, these can all coexist quite comfortably. So please do reach out with us and connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you want any free tasters of some of this stuff, we've got until the end of March, might extend it actually, because it's still getting a lot of people interested. We've got a free set of resources that you can go online to download. You'll get kind of like learning materials in your inbox every day for 7 days, all for free. That's all we've got time for today. So again, a massive thank you for joining us. Thanks again to Sam, and I really look forward to seeing you all on our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Take care.